I guarantee you one thing. We're going to be talking about those emails every moment of every day. Crooked Hillary's emails. Unless Hillary gets indicted, which, in all fairness, she should be. How can Hillary manage this country when she can't even manage her emails? This is the biggest scandal since Watergate. How about if she's running the country? She can't even run an email. She lied like a dog on her emails. She should be in prison. So we're going to get a special prosecutor, and we're going to look into it.
It's just awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
Yeah, because you'd be in jail.
So in politics, karma kicks in more quickly than in other walks of life. And it turns out that lock her up chant for Hillary Clinton's use of a personal email account just might backfire on the Trump family, specifically on Ivanka. The Washington Post reports, quote, Ivanka Trump sent hundreds of emails last year to White House aides, cabinet officials, and her assistants using a personal account, many of them in violation of federal records rules, according to people familiar with the White House examination of her correspondence. The discovery alarmed some advisors to President Trump, who feared that his daughter's practices bore similarities to personal email use of Hillary Clinton. Some aides were startled by the volume of Ivanka Trump's personal emails and taken aback by her response when questioned about the practice. She said she was not familiar with some details of the rules, according to people with knowledge of her reaction. Did she watch her dad's campaign? Dad to the rescue, though. Just in the last hour, President Trump objecting to comparisons between his daughter and his one-time political foe.
You're talking about all fake news. So what Ivanka did, it's all in the presidential records. Everything is there. There was no deletion. There was no nothing. What it is a false story. Hillary Clinton deleted 33,000 emails. She had a server in the basement. That's the real story.
Joining us now is Mike Schmidt from the New York Times. Mike Schmidt, you covered the Clinton email story. How did the Republicans on the Intel Committee, how did they latch on to this issue and unearth what turned out to be some controversial and classified material on her email server? And is it possible that Ivanka, with her foreign policy portfolio, her presence on the world stage, I think Donald Trump left her in his chair at a summit, and she spoke in Saudi Arabia, she's been to the wall in Israel, she certainly has a lot of foreign policy in her portfolio as well.
Yeah, what tripped up Clinton was that Senate Republicans sent a letter to this guy called the Inspector General for the Intelligence Community and said, hey, can you go look at Clinton's server and see if there's any classified information there? And the thing about the intelligence community is that it's not hard for them to find classified information. A lot of things are classified. And they got under the hood and they saw some classified information and they told the FBI, and that's where the problem started. So the question will be here, what will the House Democrats do that now have power? Will they ask the intelligence community to go in and look at the emails? And then what will they find? Will they find the similar problematic things? And will that lead to the same series of events that we saw where the FBI has to go in and look at it and make a conclusion about whether the information was classified and whether it was purposely put there and there should be charges? We're not there yet. We have no indication of that, but that is the path that happened to Clinton.
Phil Rucker, your colleague's great reporting that brought us this story. Talk about how easily and how quickly we could get from what you all reported last night, which we read in the introduction, and a real sticky situation for this White House.
Well, it'll get really sticky if there's an immediate House investigation in January, which I assume there will be when Democrats take over the majority. But it's going to remain a problem for Ivanka Trump, I think, perception-wise, inside the administration as well as outside of it. There are already bad feelings in the West Wing about her as somebody who's too entitled, as somebody who wants to be on the staff and have all the sort of luxuries of being on the staff, but also wants to be family and treated differently, and the rules don't always apply to her. And she can breeze in and out of the meetings that she wants to and talk to the president when she wants to and have sort of special benefits in the office, and that has rubbed people the wrong way from day one. And this email use is just another example of it. And the fact that the explanation that she somehow didn't know the rules is sort of laughable to a lot of people who work in the White House, because they all lived through the 2016 campaign.
Right.
They are so familiar with the rules.
And here's
email.
the deal. Now, maybe her dad wrote her a note and she didn't go to her ethics briefing. That's possible. Yeah. That's not snark. That's that's possible. I mean, there are things that you have to do when you go to the White House to, and I believe Hope Hicks, the president, I mean, other staffers went. Your paper and Mike's paper reported on that. But push a little farther than what you're talking about. I mean, John Kelly, the White House chief of staff, is famously the other side of the power axis from Ivanka. And there have been a lot of reports. I think Donald Trump, always does the best leaking on television with Chris Wallace, said, Kelly's really good at some stuff, not others. This certainly is a better day for the Kelly axis of power than the Ivanka power. They look not only foolish, they look in the same way people were critical of Hillary Clinton, as though she thought that the rules didn't apply to her. And she just may have done what Donald Trump described in all that sound. She just may have jeopardized national security.
Yeah, well, I don't know anything about the jeopardizing national security.
Well, I mean,
piece,
if it turns out that there's anything there,
yeah.
She certainly will be guilty of everything Donald Trump accused Hillary Clinton of.
To the extent that there's a war internally between Ivanka and Jared and John Kelly, this is a win today for John Kelly, clearly. And Kelly, by the way, whose days may potentially be numbered. We hear all sorts of mixed reporting in the last few weeks from inside the White House, but there's been a feeling that he may not sort of last beyond the end of this year. That Trump may be looking to a new chief of staff, and he has his eyes on someone named Nick Ayers, who's the VP's chief of staff, who is also a close ally of Jared and Ivanka.
I mean, can we dig into this national security point a little bit more? Yes, we don't know what, if anything, sensitive was in any email that she sent. But there's a reason that you have rules like this at the White House. It's not just for fun. It's for national security. It's important. And we are seeing this administration, whether it's President Trump's refusal to give up his own phone, the use of this private email address, which was set up after the election, the use of emails by Ivanka, who was sending emails to government officials even before she had a defined role within the White House. It's just a complete disregard to rules that are in place to protect national security at a time where we have adversaries who most likely have, bugged everything they could possibly bug to find out. This is really important. It's not just, Hillary did it too. We can't forget the reason why these rules exist.
I'm thinking that our adversaries might not need to bug us for much longer. Trump gave the Russians classified information in the Oval. He just said to Saudi Arabia, no big whoop, the dismembered journalist. Putin gets it. I'm not sure it's worth their time and tech anymore.
Fair point.
This does kind of connect to what we were talking about last segment, which is that, Jared and Ivanka have had a lot of relationships with foreign leaders, including Saudis and Emiratis, right? And I'd want to know, were they conducting some of that relationship on personal email? Because that is a national security issue. Not only is that vulnerable to hacking, it's also avoiding, despite what Trump says, if it's on personal email, it's avoiding the presidential record, right? And so, again, needs to be looked at as this love fest was developing between Mohammed bin Salman and Jared, and Ivanka may have been involved in that relationship as well. Were they conducting some of the conversations with the Saudis or the Emiratis or other people in that region on personal email accounts? And if I was a Democrat, I'd want to know the answer to that question.
And Mike, one of the things that the closest parallel to me seems to be the response. The response from the White House was almost textbook, everything you'd think you'd learn not to do from the Hillary Clinton response. The sort of saying, having a lawyer do it, the very defensive response. And Donald Trump, who sometimes has a couple-day delay to your stories or Phil Rucker's stories, seemed very briefed on this issue when he went out to the South Lawn today. If you could just sort of project forward based on the response today, what you think might happen next?
I mean, basically, it'll all come down to the question of classified, and that was the issue with Clinton, and they never really anticipated that problem coming up. They didn't think it would be the issue that it was, and then when it came, it really came and was vicious. What will need to be seen here is, well, is there a way the intelligence community gets into the emails? Is there a way, an avenue in where they start to go through in the same way they did on Hillary's and look line by line for different things? Remember things like the drone program are classified. So even references that are in newspaper articles can be seen by the intelligence community as classified. And this sort of gets back to this larger point about Trump that I think we sometimes miss, is that he came down to Washington and he never really seemed to want to change to the sensibilities of Washington. He sort of wanted to continue to sort of have the New York sensibilities that he had before, or whatever he was doing up there. And I never appreciated those nuances. And this seems like an example of that, where clearly post-2016 election, emails like this would be a problem.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.